Hey biggies, and welcome to another style-based Jonny rant. Now you'd think after 10 years of running a YouTube channel I'd have developed a pretty thick skin, and to a very real extent I've had to, but there's one phrase that still literally triggers me. I actually have a physical reaction whenever I see this in the comment section, or actually more commonly out in the world, and that is the phrase, "I don't like lager." Now there's lots of conversations I'd like to have with the people that say that kind of thing, and this video is essentially that with no guarantee that they're listening, although that's also true when I'm talking just to people, to be honest. However, I am now going to pick apart a couple of things, including why you should love lager, but also why lager is not a goddamn style. Now, if I learned one thing from my previous video, a bit like this, which was my balance versus structure video, it's that I should probably keep all of these thoughts to myself. And I can already see the YouTube comments cascading down telling me that I'm wrong, or I'm being unhelpful, or I'm being semantic, or possibly all three in one comment. So I just want to clear the air, get some things out there before I dig in to the geeky stuff. And the first one is that I know that lager is this incredibly evocative word and very, very helpful for describing one certain style of beer, which happens to be the style of beer that 70–80% of the world drink almost exclusively. And that is the International Pale Lager, or the what I would call a faux Pilsner, or macro beer in general. There's nothing wrong with those beers, and there's not a lot wrong with describing them as lagers. I'll accept that. YouTubers, stand down. Keyboard warriors, put your weapons away, right? But the issue comes with the fact that we have started to define loads and loads of different beers in exactly the same way, which is why we get people going, "I don't like lager." You probably do. You probably do like lager, because I almost guarantee you there's going to be a beer on this table that you think is absolutely brilliant, and all of these are lagers, and this is not even the fullest extent of lager styles. So let's explain why that's the case. So lager is not a style, that is a fact, okay? It is in fact a family of styles. When it comes to the taxonomy of beer, we have beer at the top, then we have ale, then we have lagers, and we have this little thing in the middle that we don't really talk about, which is Kolsch and alt beer, because we genuinely cannot quite define them. But all of these beers come from the family of lagers. So what defines a lager? It's actually incredibly simple, but also incredibly loose. So the first thing a lager has to have is a lager yeast. It's literally a different species of brewer's yeast. It acts in a different way. Most importantly, it ferments at an entirely, or prefers to ferment at an entirely different temperature to ale. So ale yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, likes to ferment around about 20, 21, 22, 23 if you're really pushing it, degrees. Americans, figure that out for yourself. So these beers ferment essentially warm, the temperature it is in this room. Lagers do not. They prefer to ferment somewhere between 8 and 12, and when they do so, because it's a slower fermentation, it's a slower reaction, they kick out all kinds of aromas, just like ale does, but they can't clear it up as quick. It's the law of thermodynamics. So then, over history, we've learned that if we chill it right down to basically freezing and store it for a long time, we slowly round out those flavours, mature the beer, and indeed, with that incredible level of maturity, we can actually develop, or more kind of expose, like a low tide exposing what's underneath the sea, we can expose lots more flavours. So I've kind of given the game away. The second thing we have to do to call a beer a lager is to cold condition it, or to lager it. And that word actually comes from the German to store, lagern. So we need to have a yeast, and we need to treat it in the way that it's supposed to, and then we can call it a lager. Now what you'll notice in that definition is I've never talked about hops, malts, history, origin, flavours, aromas, ABVs, bitterness units, any of the stuff that we generally talk about on this channel to talk about flavours. And that's because, other than perhaps having a lower yeasty kind of characteristic because of that cold fermentation, there is no real discernible difference between an ale and a lager. It's what you do with it, it's the weight of history that makes us use lager in certain ways, although as I'll get into, that's starting to disappear as well. And that's about it. It's literally, we have these two physical, natural reasons that it's a lager, and then we have what humanity has piled in on top, which is mostly delicious hops, lovely malts, lovely soft water, and varied degrees of kilned malts. So I'm going to finally pour myself a beer. The rant's over, I'm a bit ruddy-cheeked, and I'm going to get more so as I drink these. Have I picked up the right one? Yes, I have. So this is one of my favourite Pilsners from a small brewery near Bamberg in southern Germany, in Bavaria. And this is probably looking exactly like you'd expect a lager to look. And this is the style that we associate with that. It's that evocative word that I talked about. It's crystal clear, it's straw coloured, it's got a nice white head, and it smells delicious of white bread and honey and lemon. And it tastes like that as well. A little hint of bitterness that makes it a bit crisper. God damn. What are these small glasses about, Johnny? So if lager is a family, what other styles do we have? Well, the answer is lots. All of these are lagers. We can start with the original. So this is not the original Pilsner. This is a very modern, very, very amazing brewery from the Czech Republic, Vinohradsky, and this is a classic Czech Pilsner. So it's about the right strength. It's going to have decoction character, which is bready kind of caramel. It comes from boiling a portion of the grain during the mash. And they load that with their own Moravian beautifully made Czech malt, which has lots of those flavours as well. And then all of their Saaz hops, which in big quantities can give you strawberry and fresh hay, and in smaller quantities can give you beautiful honeyed, floral kind of character. So this style is big, bold, but incredibly sessionable and really bitter and really sweet to create that kind of balance within the beer. That is not your archetypal lager. That will have a lot more malt depth, a lot more character to it. The archetypal lager is the Pilsner, which the Germans invented to almost compete with the Czech ones. So this is essentially what's been bastardised by the big macro guys who have started adding corn and rice and all kinds of nonsense to make it quicker to brew, make it lighter in flavour, make it lighter in calories, carbohydrates, whatever it is they want to do. So this is what you'd think of when you think of a lager, and it has honey, lemon, all that kind of stuff that I've talked about. That is what we think of as a lager, but it comes from a different place to where lager, pale lager, was born. We then have the Helles, which is very specific to Bavaria, very specific to Munich. So this was the Munich brewery's response to these pale lagers that were doing so well all around the world. And this would be a little bit more full-bodied, a little bit more kind of honey sweet, less of that lovely hop character. They'll be using German hops, which are much more kind of dry hay and spice than on the Czech side, the Saaz. But this, looks, smells and tastes pretty similar to the other two, but much less kind of malt depth than this, but still malt sweetness, and much less hoppiness than this. So these are three beers that you could very easily mistake for international pale lagers, macro lagers, if they weren't absolutely delicious. And I can assure you all three of these are. So that's just three different kinds of pale lager. Now we're going to get into what I would call the historic styles of lager. So we're going to start with a Dunkel. So this is a German Dunkel, and these would have been what a lot of the Germans were making before pale lager came around. So we're talking pre-1842, probably for a couple of hundred years. Back when we didn't know how to make pale malt, we were kilning it over fire, which meant that we got beyond caramelization and into literal burning. And so all the beers back then would have been a little bit dark and probably a little bit smoky as well. Now, Dunkels are not smoky generally anymore, unless you're buying sort of, well, essentially the smoky beers from Bamberg, like Schlenkerla and Spezial. This is a dark, malty, roasty, coffee-tinged, caramel-tinged lager. So it's still clean and snappy, still got lots of the character from these, from the malt and from the hops, but it's darker and it's essentially a little bit coffee tinged. That's what all lagers would have been like a couple of hundred years ago. Then we move to the style that kind of made these. So this is actually a Märzen, and this comes from Braybrook, one of the best lager producers in the UK. The Märzen was created when two guys, Anton Dreher and Gabriel Sedelmeier, went over pretty much on a gap year. They were those guys. They talk too much about their gap year. Went on a tour of Europe learning all about beer because one of them owned a brewery and the other one was the son of the owner of Spaten Brewery in Munich. They ended up in the UK At one point they were walking around with a hollow walking stick stealing samples, proper James Bond stuff. But they came back having learned how we were making pale malt in the UK, which was via indirect fire, so keeping the flames and the smoke away from the malt. They came back and they created their own pale malts. In Germany they called it the Märzen. They brewed it in March to ferment and condition over the summer, hence March. Märzen, and in Vienna they called it the Vienna lager. So the difference between those two is very, very slight, using similar techniques, slightly different sources of the malt back then. But basically Vienna lagers, flavour-wise, are almost identical to the Märzen. Which brings us to the fest beer. So as I said, the Märzens were brewed to condition over the summer. And so they'd have been coming out around the time of Oktoberfest, which would have started about 30, 40 years before, 20 years before the Märzen was invented. So the fest beers before then would have been these Dunkels. Then they became these ones, particularly at the Spartan tents, the Spartan bars. So a fest beer and a Märzen initially were the same kind of beer. In fact, they probably didn't even call it a fest beer. But over the years, these beers have got paler and paler because these styles have always been popular. So we've created a new style called the fest beer, which is actually a bit like a Hellerbock, but a little bit dry, a little bit less sweet, potentially a little bit hoppier, I've kind of found. Then we have the Keller beer. History of this is a little bit complex. There's two kinds of Keller beer. This one I have here, it's from Nuremberg, but it's kind of in the Munich style. So essentially it's an unfiltered, unpasteurized, shorter lagered beer that exhibits a bit more yeasty kind of character. I absolutely love them because you get a little bit of kind of banana. You get a really rich body from them because, you know, they're totally unfiltered. There's still proteins in there. It's a beautiful style from Munich, but it's entirely different to what you get in Bamberg, where it's dark and sweet, a little bit like a Märzen, but a little bit sweeter, and all about the beautiful, rich caramel kind of malts. And then if you go to northern Germany, you get a Dortmunder style lager, which is essentially all that Lossengrande make, even though they make Hellers and Pilsners, all kinds of stuff. Everything is really dry and a good whack of bitterness, which is basically a Dortmunder style. You might even get a little hint of kind of sulfuriness from the water or from the yeast that adds to that dryness and that almost funkiness that you get in a northern German Pilsner. So Jever is the most famous example of that, but there's lots of them around, and this is a great one from Lost and Grounded. So there you go. We've done 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 distinct styles of lager so far. So now we're going to hop across the border and talk about the dark lagers of the Czech Republic. So they don't just make pale pilsners, they make beautiful, beautiful and varied styles of beer. If you're ever in Prague, go to U Fleku and have, it depends on your point of view, but sometimes it's called a Černý, which means black. Sometimes it's called a Tmavý, which means dark. But we're talking about these dark, decocted lagers with big Saaz kind of character. And I'm a bit torn about which to open here, because this one is absolutely stunning, loads of Saaz character, my favourite European hop. And this one is double decocted, but it's made all with English ingredients. So between the two, you get the perfect traditional dark lager. I'm going to go with this one because it's lower ABV. So this is from Phantom, one of my favourite new breweries in the UK. And this is, you know, they are not a brewery that I think really focused on lagers, but they do make, this is a beautiful, beautiful beer. That's a lager, folks. So if you say you don't like lager, you only drink porter, and we've had many of those comments on the YouTube channel, give this a go. So this is going to have lots of this kind of the sweet malt character that we've talked about, lots of the floral character that we've talked about in the hops, but it's going to have a very different character from the fact that they've used kilned, speciality, roasted malts to varying degrees to create coffee, chocolate, burnt toast, caramel, toffee, raisins, dates, figs. It's a ton of coffee on that. So it's only really the malts that are making this huge, huge difference to the beer, but they're still very much lagers. They still have exactly the same kinds of yeast. In fact, this has the Weihenstephan yeast, and the same hops as this one, and most other Czech Pilsners, but it tastes entirely different. So this is showing huge variety. You know, all of these fall within a bell curve. Suddenly we're flattening out and we're going, what on earth is this? Now there's a style that I couldn't actually get hold of because it's that rare. But that is the Baltic Porter. Now, we've done a whole video on this when we could get hold of some, and it has an incredible history, but it is still a lager, even though it's called a porter. It comes from the days when we were exporting porter and stout porter, I should say, all the way to Russia, to the oligarchs up there in St. Petersburg in the 18th and 19th century. When we stopped doing that, because we fell out with Denmark and fell out with Russia, and this is what the Brits do, we fall out with people, all the regions that were stop-offs on the way to St. Petersburg suddenly lost their supply of porter. So they started brewing their own, and they were using lager yeasts, and you ended up with the Baltic Porter, which is essentially a beer a bit like this, absolutely amped up to the max. So it's really crisp and clean, but loads and loads of that roasted character. So on that note, we've covered kind of all of the historical styles, all of the ones that tell the story effectively of beer in Europe, excluding Belgium and the UK, for centuries. These are such important styles, such distinctive styles. Now, of course, post-craft beer revolution, we had to go messing with perfection, messing with diversity, messing with history, and create brand new styles that nobody asked for, but actually, in retrospect, quite a lot of us want, including me. So if this was the classic section, this was the dark section, this was the historic section, this is the affront to Pilsner section, and I say that with love, and I'm going to drink the hell out of, well, all three of them eventually, but only one of them on this video. And these are the modern interpretations of historic styles, or indeed, not even just reinterpretations of historic styles, reinterpretations of modern styles. Now, before we get to the first of these, I have to tell you a little story, and it's a story that's going to be told in my forthcoming book, which isn't out for a year. I'm nailing this marketing, but it is about how beer changed the world. And there's an incredible story of the German immigrants going over to the US in huge numbers and wanting to brew lager. There wasn't really a beer scene over there when they were emigrating in the mid-1800s. Mostly they were drinking whiskey and having fights. So the Germans went over there and started brewing these German styles of beer, but they didn't have access to all of the German ingredients that they would have had. And actually they were finding that brewing classic German styles with American malt was very difficult. They were used to 2-row malt, 6-row malt in America, loads of proteins, kept coming out hazy, not having the flavours or the textures that they wanted. So they substituted part of that malt bill with rice or with corn. And that was the creation of the American pale lager, or even the American light lager, which has a similar thing. So that's Budweiser's story, essentially, and Coors' story. They're all German names. Budweiser was Anheuser and Busch. Coors was Coors, but it's spelled Kohrs. So these are all German immigrants. All of the big American lager breweries were Pabst as well. So on the table here, I have a Mexican lager, which, as far as I can tell, is craft beer's euphemism for we made an American light lager. But we definitely used corn. That's apparently the way that they ensure you that it is Mexican. This one is a delicious beer. Is made by Fierce up in Scotland. It's an absolutely phenomenal beer made with lots and lots of lime as well. So they are essentially trying to recreate the Corona. So that's bastardization of Pilsner number one. Well, number two, I guess, after Budweiser. So next we head to pretty much the only Western European country I haven't mentioned yet, and that is Italy. And they are the inventors of actually one of my favourite brand new styles of beer. Well, not that brand new, it's getting pretty old now, a couple of decades, but this is the Italian Pilsner. Now, the Italian Pilsner takes a lot of inspiration from the Czech Pilsner, very similar malt kind of body, probably not decocted, that would be too much, but a rich malt body, and then lots and lots of German hops, in fact, big Mittelfrüh kind of character, big, dry hay, grass, lemon kind of character. But then they dry hop it. So dry hopping is the process of adding the hops once, either during fermentation or once the fermentation has completed. With all of these other beers, they've been added during the boil pretty much exclusively. So you're throwing these pretty grassy, pretty herbal hops into the dry hop, which to an American would seem absolutely absurd. You only throw in the juiciest, piniest, grapefruitiest, zestiest hops. But they're doing it with these big, grassy hops. And what you get is a really drying effect of loads of fresh grass, loads of lemon zest rather than the juice. And a stunning, dry, floral, grassy, fresh kind of character with big bitterness, both from what's added to the boil and from the fact that dry hopping can add kind of dry, powdery bitterness as well. And what it makes for is an incredibly crisp but super aromatic beer that I've absolutely fallen in love with. And I think is a beautiful addition to this kind of pale category. And then we get on to the experiments that are happening now in the craft beer industry. It's very much the American approach to lager. It's going, hey, that tradition's cool, but have you tried throwing Citra in it? And that's what Elusive have done by brewing essentially, some people call them West Coast Pils. They've just called this a Citra Pilsner because I don't really think that West Coast Pils should or could or is a thing. So this is a Citra hopped Pilsner. So we're taking these super clean bases, no yeast character, very light, honeyed, bready malt character, and throwing in big quantities of beautiful American aromatic hops. And the idea of this and the IPL, and indeed the cold IPA, which is in the Kolschi Ulti, we don't really talk about that area. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to create this real crisp snap that great lagers, whether they're dark, strong, weak, light, have, while also delivering on that massive hop aroma that most beer geeks certainly started absolutely loving and now may have moved on to other places. So yeah, I mean, it smells like an American pale ale with pine and grapefruit. Sherbety as well. Yeah, really sherbety. Lemon sherbet. It smells delicious. I think a lot of people are dismissive of West Coast Pilsners. In fact, I've just been pretty dismissive of West Coast Pilsners there. And any style in which you throw American aroma hops into a traditional German or Czech style lager. But it's this kind of experimentation that has resulted in all of these. It just happened 150 years ago. I'm sure there were people that were skeptical and frustrated and snobbish about all of these styles as they came out at their various points throughout the 19th century. And we need to remember not to be doing that with our modern styles, because this is bona fide delicious. The bitterness is very much in check, which would be a big concern with these big beers. And it's that kind of innovation that leads to new styles, exciting stuff that can create the kind of heritage that we have here over in the States, or indeed in Berkshire, where this was brewed. So there we go. If the edit goes well, that should be roughly the history of lager in less than 20 minutes, but more importantly, me showing you the incredible diversity that is within the lager family. It's not as much as the ale family, but this is not exhaustive. There are so many other lager styles out there, and there's so many different styles to get excited about. So if you're one of those people that said you don't like lager, please listen to me when I say it's just a yeast, it's just a process. You can do whatever you want with it, and that is representative on this table. Literally now on the Craft Beer channel, my biggest mission is to get people as excited about lager as I am, because ale so often speaks for itself. Lager is quiet, it sits at the back, it has 6 lagers itself, and then doesn't really know how to talk about itself, and that's what I've tried to do here. So let me know your favourite lagers. Let me know where I should be going and what I should be talking about to get people excited about lager. And otherwise, just every time you see a different lager on the shelf, give it a go and tell your friends about it. Prost, na zdraví, cheers, love and beer.